Thank you everyone for joining us today for Emerald's webinar series. My name is Damian Gallagher, and I have a couple of colleagues with me here today. I have Elliot Foster. Thanks for coming up, Elliot.
Sure. Hey, everybody.
And I also have David Volpe. So Elliot and I both work on the business development and client services team here at Team Emerald. And David is our Deputy Chief Investment Officer and the Portfolio Manager for our Growth Opportunities Strategy and Insights Fund. And just as a reminder on the Emerald webinar series, it's something that we'll be producing every couple of months. And really the purpose of this is to give our investment team a chance to tell you about some of the exciting new innovations and advancements happening across different sectors out there in the investable universe.
Thanks, Damien, and thanks for organizing this. So I've been with Emerald for 21 years. Prior to that, I was involved in the energy industry in part. I was the first deputy controller in Philadelphia, and we were responsible for the oversight of the Philadelphia Gas Works. I was the chief investment officer of the Philadelphia Gas Works. So I have a long history of following and investing in the overall energy, traditional and alternative energy industries.
All right, thank you. So some of you might have seen on our website back at the beginning of the year, David and one of our associates, Eric Cianci, put out a white paper on the energy sector and really focused on renewables and the evolution of clean tech. So just to kind of set a baseline for our audience, if you could just please define what is clean tech and where are we today in kind of the energy and clean tech space?
Well, first off, Eric did most of the work on this. He did a great job just setting the stage in January for what we saw and what we expected to see in 2021. Believe it or not, renewable energies, and I will go into what that is, resources, was the best performing industry last year in terms of performance, small cap, mid cap. On the small caps within the index, it was up over 600% in 2020. But I like this definition. Renewable energy is energy from sources that are naturally replenishing, but flow limited. Renewable resources are virtually inexhaustible in duration, but limited in the amount of energy that is available per unit of time. I think that encapsulates it. And so, when we look at investing at Emerald, whether it's small, mid, all cap, and other areas, we're looking for growth companies. So that's really important to us, to find growth companies, to find innovators, to find disruptors, whether they be in the traditional energy space or in the alternative energy space. And I think we've done that over the years, certainly over the 20 plus years I've been here.
Yeah, okay, well thank you. So we'll definitely dive into some of those kind of more minute differences in the traditional and alternative energy spaces later in the discussion. But now that we've really kind of set the stage for alternative energies out there and really what clean tech is, what alternatives do you think are really poised to emerge as the dominant competitors to traditional fossil fuels over the next 5, 10, 50 years? And do you have a timeline on really a mass adoption of these alternatives that are out there and currently in development?
Yeah. The timing of this webcast couldn't be better. You're seeing right now what's going on in Europe. And I like to call this the curse or the time of unintended consequences, because we're seeing all this discussion, all these policies, whether they be governmental policies or investment policies that are restricting access to capital, increasing regulatory constraints on traditional oil and gas. And we're seeing what the consequences of that, at least in the short term, short to medium term, are right now. If you just look at Europe, where you've seen natural gas prices go up almost tenfold in the last year. The cost of that just dramatically encumbering the European economy, going from energy cost of $200 million a day to over $1 billion. The overall cost going from less than $5 per MCFE to up to $29. And so there's so much going on right now that affects every aspect of our economy, the worldwide economy, and quite frankly, just people in general. If we get a bad winter in Europe, it's going to cause some serious, serious problems, both economically and socially there. So right now, it is a mixture of looking at traditional oil and gas and other sources, fossil fuels, which quite frankly, I said earlier that in 2020, renewable industries were the best performing industry in the universes. This year, it's the traditional energy, oil and gas, that have been the best performing stocks within the indices. So you have to look at things on a short-term basis and a longer-term basis. One of the purposes of our report was to look at what's going on now and also prognosticating on what's investable, short, medium, and longer term. And we took the position that, yeah, there's a lot of good things going on in the renewable resource area, but a lot of it is really not that investable. So a lot of the movement in 2020 of these stocks was, I'd say, a little more hype than actual substance. So fortunately, and again, I encourage you to read the paper, we saw through that, we highlighted that, what some of the issues were in terms of whether they be supply constraints or just in terms of earliness of technologies, highlighted that and factored that into our overall investment thesis. So right now, yes, there's a lot of discussion on hydrogen. There's a lot of discussion on carbon capture. There's movement in terms of sustainable aviation fuels. But a lot, and again, a lot going on, some of it being investable currently. Again, we're the type of investor that we're not just looking at what's 10 years from now, what's going to be great. Invest in us now because 10 years from now, what we have in our portfolio is going to be great. No, we're going to hopefully deliver short, medium term, as well as in the longer term. So some of these the newer areas, and again, even the newness. Solar's been around. What if I told you solar's been around? Photovoltaic cells, or the theory, has been around since 1839. Wind, as you know, has been around for hundreds of years. So none of this is really new. The adoption in terms of mass adoption in the US and worldwide has been newer. So it has been over the last 20 or 30 years. But the technologies have been out there for a long time. And it's really important to note that these things take a long time. You don't just switch off. You don't switch off one energy source. You didn't go from coal, for example, and putting it in ships to oil. That took many, many, many years, if not decades. It's the same thing here in terms of the switch from traditional oil sources or energy sources to renewable. It's going to take a long time. There's going to be winners. There's going to be losers. Hopefully we'll be able to find many of those winners.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I know you did talk a lot about kind of what we're doing in the space in terms of looking at the energy sector, and I think active managers, and in particular growth managers like Emerald, are not looking at the energy space, probably in part due to its really next to nothing weight in the growth indices out there. It's more seen, I think, also as a stereotypical value sector. So can you share kind of why Emerald and why you're looking at energy and really find it as an attractive growth opportunity for an active manager?
Sure. Well, following energy for 20 years, the last 10 prior to 2020 was not a lot of fun. It was very, very difficult because there was not, while there was a lot of newness in terms of the traditional energy space, the performance just wasn't there. Well, things changed. A number of things changed. The producers got capital discipline over the last couple of years, which has been beneficial for the overall industry on the traditional side. And also some of the technologies we've talked about in terms of renewable are becoming much more mainstream. And efficiencies are occurring. I think we have a slide, and this just shows the benefits of technological improvement and efficiencies, because you can see the dramatic reduction in the cost on a levelized cost of electricity of, for example, solar, photovoltaic, or wind in terms of onshore and even offshore wind, and seeing that dramatic decline in terms of cost and much more competitive. So you needed to get to a point where these other energy sources are competitive on a like basis to traditional energy sources. We are there now. Now, you still have to work with the inconsistencies of these energy sources, as we saw in Texas, for example, as we see right now in Europe or China. Hydro is a source of renewable energy. Well, there was a drought, both in China and Brazil. So hydro was not as prevalent in terms of being able to be an energy source. So they had to rely more on natural gas and on coal, push the price up there. Obviously, the same would be true in terms of the UK and Europe in terms of offshore wind. For whatever reason, this last year, it wasn't as windy. Well, what happens then? These are inconsistent, interruptible energy sources. You have to use more traditional. And when that happens, you push the price up of the traditional. So it's important to note that while these renewable sources are more cost competitive, they still are not the same, and you still have to supplement them with existing traditional energy sources. And that's going to be the case for a long time, and that's why it's really important from both a policy perspective and an investment perspective to take those things into consideration.
Okay.
And I should say, I apologize, I didn't fully answer the question. So at the beginning of this year, energy got down to 2.1 or 2.3% of the S&P. So it was almost, inconsequential in terms of an asset class. That has increased over the year, certainly. But when you look at the policy, you look at the ESG restrictions, you look at the regulatory constraints, capital constraints, it's really narrowed down the amount of capital flowing into for investment, both as us as money managers, but also as companies themselves, and financial tools going into these companies to invest. And so, yes, it's a smaller universe, but guess what? Last year, best performing asset class, renewable resources. This year, best performing asset class, traditional energy. So it still does matter. And if you're an active manager, guess what you can do? You can take advantage of that. And we do.
That's great. Thank you. So just to kind of piggyback on what you said earlier on the volatility we saw in 2020, particularly within the energy space, both on renewables and traditional side.
Yeah.
I know in your white paper you said that really one of the major drivers for that was that people were trading the energy sector on emotion, right? A lot of big ideas of things that might be coming down the pike some point in the future. So do you think that we'll see kind of similar volatility as we head into the end of 2021 and even into 2022, or not, and why or why not? What do you think might drive kind of pricing?
Yeah, from a behavior and emotion perspective, I think we will. If you recall back to April of 2020, WTI crude went negative to the tune of $35 some odd. So it was a great opportunity if you were a patient investor to invest in commodity-linked stocks. We did, certainly in our all-cap portfolio. We had a number of names that we added to or established positions in based on that emotion, based on that concern, which we didn't believe was justified for the longer term, because guess what happened? Yes, there was demand destruction due to COVID, but what's happened beyond, well, I said earlier, pushing prices up because of lack of wind, because of lack of hydro. Demand has come back much faster than people thought it would. Whether it's driving, whether it's industry, whether it's aviation. Now you're actually starting to see some, aviation fuel needs in terms of improvements there in terms of demand. So, yeah, we saw the demand. We thought the demand would come back earlier. It did, and that's pushed prices up. WTI hit $75 today. Brent hit almost 80. I think it actually went over 80. And you've had natural gas was $6.50 last night. So just a dramatic increase. Wow. Now, over the long term, you need to have that for demand destruction to get the prices down. It also will, over the long term, help the adoption of renewable energy sources. High price, high pollutant, carbon-based fuels, you want to transition over. And one of the ways you do that is continue to reduce the cost of the renewable energy, the cost there in terms of levelized cost. And also, if you push the price up of the fossil fuels, that will push people to migrate over to the renewables. Takes time, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And also now we saw, and we actually noted in the paper, you started seeing even 6 to 9 months ago supply constraints. So we see that now. Just like you see in automobiles, you can't buy new cars or washing machines. A lot of the solar manufacturers, wind manufacturers, and others are seeing supply constraints in terms of their supply chain, which is having an impact. And so you have to take that into consideration as an investor. Not only a disruptive, innovative technology, but practically how quickly that adoption can be rolled out based on the supply availability. So you see that in terms of photovoltaic cells, in terms of some of the equipment, microprocessing equipment that go into the solar equipment. And so we have to take that into consideration.
Okay, so really you think it will continue the volatility then?
I think it will continue the volatility both in terms of supply, demand, emotion, and let's be honest, traditional commodities, whether oil or particularly natural gas, are some of the most volatile commodities there are. So you have to be willing to invest around that volatility, take advantage of that volatility in terms of your investment thesis.
Okay, so just to shift gears a little bit, because you did talk about how long it would take, right, for the adoption of some of these newer technologies and renewables pick up just because you can't flip a switch and go from
Right.
solar or wind
Right.
away from traditional. I think there's been a lot of advancements in the fossil fuel space, right? We've seen a lot of kind of ways to make fossil fuels cleaner, more efficient, and just better kind of all across the board.
Absolutely.
So can you talk about some of the technological advancements that we have seen recently in the fossil fuel space that have really improved their efficiencies and cleanliness?
Well, they're not emitting as much methane in terms of a traditional oil or gas well. That was a big constraint or issue, was air quality in terms of methane emissions. So they're working on that. There is some carbon capture going on in certain areas, and I think that will continue dramatically to improve. You look at pretty much every oil and gas company, they have a whole ESG statement. So they are truly trying to, and many of them are actually getting involved in, they're leaving, whether you look at the majors or even some of the smaller players and service providers, they're migrating from more traditional investment and equipment manufacturing or utilization more towards renewable. So necessarily, they are moving much towards net neutral or climate neutrality. So the existing oil and gas companies are doing an enormous amount to reduce their carbon footprint, and many of them, as I was saying, are moving over towards becoming much more renewable-oriented companies. And so we have, as a number of investments in our portfolio, companies that both act and are involved in both aspects, be it traditional carbon-based fossil fuels as well as renewables. And that goes with, in some respects, something I'll talk about as we move on in terms of our picks and shovel approach. We're not looking to invest in companies that are at the leading edge of technology. We're looking to invest in companies that more have a picks and shovel approach, razor blades. I'd rather be selling those razor blades to a whole variety of different firms, whether they be the winners and or the not so much winners, but that are going to utilize my equipment, for example. So we have a company that is one of the largest manufacturers of equipment for storage and transportation of most energy molecules. Have another investment, which is the largest LNG exporter in the U.S. Have other investments which again are involved in various aspects of both carbon capture as well as energy storage. But again, not so much on the leading or bleeding edge of the technology, those that will be selling into, whether it be the chemicals, whether it be the equipment, whether it be other aspects of the business model into these other companies. And that's been more geared towards our investment philosophy, and it served us really well in terms of modulating that volatility you talked about a little bit earlier.
Okay, so let's kind of build on that a little bit. So outside of really the picks and shovels approach on the renewable side, what at Emerald are you doing and your team doing in terms of evaluating both traditional and renewable energy companies? What are you considering when you're looking to invest in those types of companies?
So, this just lists out some of our criteria, what we look for at Emerald. And this can be used both for in terms of the energy side, whether it be a traditional or renewable, and also in some of our other investment areas. But most importantly, always looking, our preference is always undercovered and underfollowed stocks, growth stocks that are undercovered, as well as companies with large and growing TAMs, gaining market share, and a clean path to taking share. These are some of our best investment ideas. Proven technologies, as I said, not bleeding edge, our science fair projects. Picks and shovels I talked about, that's really important to us. I want a company that, again, can thrive and win under most scenarios, not have to be the winner. Because this, if you look at renewable energy in particular, and you look at the number of companies, number of SPACs, for example, on the storage, on charging, on hydrogen, you name it. There are dozens upon dozens of companies that have come out. Well, necessarily, they can't all be winners. Sure. We obviously try and find some of the winners, some of those that will have those great growing TAMs that will be the market share leaders. But more importantly, I'd rather have companies that are selling into them. Because the technology is going to work in terms of hydrogen, for example, CCUS, whatever it is. Those are going to be adopted. So I want the companies that are going to be selling in to them services, equipment, because those will be the ones that necessarily will thrive. And so we've got a number of those in our portfolio, and they have been very, very strong performers. So looking for commodity price beneficiaries in certain cases, that's the difference with traditional oil and gas now. Used to be, a lot of the companies would just spend. The whole idea was to spend to grow, any amount to grow. Well, now you've had some capital discipline. So guess what's growing? Not in terms of the revenues, not in terms of production, but cash flow is growing. Cash flow for some of these traditional oil and gas names, or some of the equipment manufacturers and producers, are growing dramatically. So we've had to look at it in a little different way in terms of growth companies. Not so much growth of revenues, maybe not even so much growth of earnings, but growth of cash flow. And a lot of these with, particularly now, as I said earlier, WTI at 75, Brent at 80, natural gas in the US at $6, natural gas in Europe at almost $29, you're going to have tremendous growth of cash flow for a lot of these companies. And so in the, for example, in the Insights Fund, the all-cap portfolios, we've got a number of holdings that are going to be beneficiaries of that increasing cash flow due to that capital discipline. And due to some of the issues right now we're seeing in terms of the timing mismatches between the policies and the investment and for newer energy sources, and currently what's doable, pushing up the price of some of the traditional oil and gas names.
Okay. So this is a little bit off script, but just, we talked about it in the beginning, how this couldn't be more timely of a topic, right, with what's going on in terms of just the thirst for energy out there today, right? Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about what risks Europe and maybe other parts of the world face in terms of shortage of energy?
They face a real risk. I mean, when you talk about lack of wind, you talk about lack of hydro, you talk about the geopolitical situation there in terms of trying to get enormous amounts of natural gas from Russia on pipelines that in some cases haven't been built or that are being disputed. So if you're the UK, which has tremendous, right now, gasoline shortages, let alone driver shortages. If you talk about Europe as a whole, that usually would go through the last few months in terms of a fill season for their natural gas. They're filling the tanks up. Mm-hmm. They haven't been able to do that. So if we get a particularly cold winter in Europe, it's going to cause both economic and social devastation. You're going to see people in very, very difficult positions because not only will the price go up, but the availability won't be there. And so it's something that policymakers really have to consider in terms of these policies. And again, I'm very much for renewable energy sources. I think it is the way of the future, and we've been able to profit from it. But you have to do it in a way that takes into consideration not cratering your economy, as well as not affecting and hurting your citizens.
All right, well, thank you. So I'd like to save a little bit of time for audience Q&A. So if we could, we'll take a quick 1-minute break. I'm going to sub out for Elliot, and he'll take over to answer some of the questions from the audience. So thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, to our webinar. My name's Elliot Foster, again, part of the business development team at Emerald, and we truly appreciate you joining us today. Now, David, we have a lot of questions, obviously. This is a very timely subject. It's on the news a lot, obviously. I got up this morning, it was all over the news. Some of the questions that we have, such as this one, the first one. Liquefied natural gas has been a major source of alternative energy in the United States in recent years. Can you talk about specifically about some of the technological advancements and uses of this alternative energy?
Well, I wouldn't actually call liquefied natural gas an alternative. It's coming from a fossil fuel. It's just liquefied natural gas. And we saw 15, 20 years ago, we were going to import it. Right. Now we made the decision, it was obviously necessary to, now we're a great exporter of LNG. And as I said, we have an investment which is a very, very large exporter of LNG in the US. And so it is a great transition fuel. It's the fuel that of necessity, of absolute necessity, to get us to carbon neutrality that's talked about over the next 20 and 30 years. You need LNG. Not only in the US, we can produce it, right, and produce it at an enormously economical cost vis-a-vis some other jurisdictions. But if you're Japan, you're China, you're Europe, you rely on this because you do not have the natural gas production present, or you may have geopolitical difficulties that I talked about earlier in terms of securing that natural gas. So it is a truly fantastic and necessary transition fuel worldwide.
Sure. Next question, and I think this is actually a very, very good question, and I thought about this. Can you talk about the efficiency and byproducts that we use in everyday life that comes from 1 barrel of oil? I really don't, the second part of the question, I don't think people understand all of the products that come from oil.
Well, you're looking at your computer, so the screen, the whole infrastructure around the computer, some type of a C4, which is either natural gas or carbon-based fuel source. Virtually everything we do, from actually the vaccines that are manufacturing have glycerin or glycol in them, which is a petroleum-based substance in terms of a stabilizer. When we look at a camera, we look at a phone, we look at diapers, we look at household products. Virtually everything has a byproduct of natural gas liquids, oil, etc. So while we talk about, and it sounds great that we're going to become we're going to get rid of all polluting carbons.
Sounds good.
It sounds good.
Yeah.
It's much more difficult to do.
Yeah.
So it's something we have to consider.
What do you think needs to happen? Next question. What do you think needs to happen in order for the United States to achieve its goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2050? And do you think that's possible?
Yeah, we have to reduce carbon emissions by, I think, 4 or 5% a year over the next 30 years. That's a lot.
Yeah.
It's an awful, awful lot. So is it possible? Sure. But along the way, and part of the whole discussion today has been a law of unintended consequences. And that when you make these decisions, these policies, and they may be good policies, there are going to be unintended consequences, which means in the short term you're going to have more volatility, price volatility in commodities. They're going to cost more oftentimes. Right. They're going to affect the economy and affect people. That price increases or lack of availability, when you don't invest in something, when you regulate an entity, when you don't put capital into an entity. Yeah. What happens is it may push prices up, it make it less available, you have supply constraints, supply crunches, and it makes for a very, very difficult transition. So we're going to have to get past that over the next 3, 5, 10 years. And that transition is going to be bumpy, but it's going to be necessary.
I guess the question I have is, what does that regulatory environment look like? And is it possible to even model something like that to get to the other side? I mean, is that possible? Can you do that?
Well, again, for us, we're looking at companies that can thrive in most regulatory environments, that can thrive whether they be a traditional or more catering towards the renewable, that will be beneficiaries on either side, and then be able to benefit through that transition. So we're looking for names like that, whether it be on the LNG side, which we talked about, whether it would be on the storage and transportation of energy molecules, we'll call it, whether it be the oxygen, whether it be hydrogen, whether it be natural gas, whatever it is. So we're looking for names that could be beneficiaries and that are not affected as dramatically through this transition, because there's going to be winners and losers,
sure,
inevitably.
All right, here's a trick question. Not really trick, but do your numbers on declining costs of photovoltaics include the limited life cycle of the panels and the disposal costs of the toxic materials used?
They're not my numbers. These are coming from outside sources like the IEA or the EIA. Probably not. Yeah. Probably not. So I would say that while the levelized cost has come down, and it truly has, there is no question. But yes, there are, just like in anything, I talk about continually unintended consequences, sure, and things you don't think about. But yes, so when you talk about the mining, yeah, for lithium to go into batteries for storage, well, that's polluting any way you look at it. When you talk about, as you said, the disposal of some of these panels, which have a limited lifespan. Yeah. So yeah, that you have to take those things into consideration, and oftentimes they are not. Yeah. But the bottom line is the cost has come down. Significantly.
Yeah. Are there any new energy sources out there that you haven't mentioned in the presentation or in the white paper that you produce? Is there anything cutting edge that's beyond cutting edge even that's out there that maybe we just don't hear about?
Well, our firm has followed a company that's going to make, power out of a unique light source, for example, but
Right.
I'm not even going to give them the name. But yeah, so not really. I mean, people have settled that hydrogen, it's going to be a hydrogen economy. CCUS, in terms of the capture of whatever carbon is emitted, is going to be important. Reforestation, that's something that we don't talk about a lot. A part of this is going to be reforestation. But it's going to take an amalgam of approaches. It's not just one thing. You're not going to have one energy source that's going to be the be-all and end-all. There's going to be different energy sources for different things, whether it be long-haul trucking, whether it be energy storage, whether it be local trucking, whatever it is, as well as just different modes of transportation. So there'll be different energy sources that are used and combinations thereof. Solar, wind, hydrogen, storage, as we transition.
And I'm just curious, is that more, for something like that to take shape, is that a public-private type partnership that would need to be done?
Oh, absolutely. And oftentimes if it's a utility, it's got ratepayers, and so they're a little bit more towards the public side. You got the United States and other governments who are pushing the policy. And if you look at one of the things we noted in our paper, and we saw changes in terms of the CARES Act, for example, which extended the tax credits for both wind and solar in terms of PTC and ITC. Yeah. And then if you look at now the budget reconciliation bill, if it were to pass, it has an enormous number of initiatives and aspects and proposals that are beneficial to renewable energy companies, be it on hydrogen, be it on solar, be it on wind in terms of extending those tax credits, be it on sustainable fuels. So there's a whole plethora of different initiatives.
If it passes.
If it passes.
Can you talk about EVs? What are your thoughts on EVs in general? And do you believe that they will replace traditional gasoline-powered vehicles at some point in the next 10 to 20 years?
If you believe, the auto manufacturers are, that's the direction they're going.
Yeah.
I mean, so if you look at some of the Nordic countries, you've got now Norway, 70-80% of their car sales are now EVs. So the likelihood is, yes, it will go that direction. But again, there's a whole issue there in terms of, okay, where do you get the power to provide the electricity locally, both through the utility to the home, to be able to power these? And then as we branch out to different industrial and commercial uses, it's going to be a challenge to provide that power. But is that the direction? Yeah, I would say so, yes.
Yeah. Now, you've been covering energy for a long time. I mean, compared to when you first started, and this is a question I have, what's the commonalities that you see and what's really different? I mean, are you blown away by the technology that you're seeing in the energy space? Is it something you kind of expected? Or?
No, I'm not blown away at all.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets to, I said earlier, you get to a point where technologies are around for a long time. We use solar, start really used in large effect in terms of NASA was using it in terms of some of the space missions. That's really where it picked up, and been using wind for hundreds of years in some capacity. So the technologies have been out there. It's the idea of making them cost competitive. And then having a policy initiative behind it. But that cost competitiveness is critical, and certainly we saw that. We've seen it so many different places, whether it be in terms of chip production. You get to a point where Moore's law sets in, and they keep going down in terms of price until recently. And so it's inevitable that that's going to occur.
Yeah. We're going to be wrapping up here fairly soon. Just one more question. Which alternative energy source, if any, is as efficient as fossil fuels? Sorry.
It's really hard. They're all different.
Yeah.
For hydrogen packs a lot of energy per unit of mass. But in terms of volume, its density is low because it's a light element.
Yeah.
So they're all different. But your good old-fashioned internal combustion motor is pretty darn efficient.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult to get to a point where you surpass that efficiency. Certainly, if you look at some of the newer EVs where they've got 4 motors and just enormous amount of horsepower, they're becoming very, very, very efficient.
Competitive, yeah. All right. Well, David, thank you very much for sharing your expertise, especially today with energy being front and center and a lot of the news that we're seeing. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for our webinar series, Beyond Oil and Gas. But thank you again for taking time out of your day to join us, and please stay tuned for the next one coming soon.